Hello again. I am Louis Marvin, a project coordinator with the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, or NSVRC. NSVRC is a division of Respect Together. And we're glad to have you back and to have our friends and collaborators from MenHealing back for this fourth session of our webinar series on working with men who are survivors of sexual assault. And I will, after some of these housekeeping announcements, pass it to Sharon from MenHealing and the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center to do a fuller introduction of today's session and of those organizations. But just a couple notes before we do that. This session is being recorded, and all sessions in this series have been and will be recorded and made available on nsvrc.org. And we have a YouTube playlist started. Eventually, we'll get that link posted in the chat. Thanks, Ashley. And everything's posted there first. So that's the best and quickest way to get access to the recordings before we get them up on our website. And once again, you don't have to participate in all of the sessions to participate in any of them. So we'd love to see you at each session, but that's not a requirement to participate. And so you'll be able to catch up if you miss one by accessing that YouTube playlist. And as always, if you have a colleague who didn't sign up because they couldn't make earlier ones, know that they can still sign up. Just another reminder that I've addressed this a couple months in a row, a couple sessions in a row, but there is no August session. There are 6 sessions total. This is the 4th one. Then we'll have a June and July session. At some point, the Zoom recurring meeting settings got a little funky, and I haven't deleted that August session yet because I just want to be clear with everyone before I do that nothing's gone wrong when that happens. I know that was a little confusing to me too, but to all of you when I sent that notice out about something being rescheduled. So a couple more notes. Closed captioning is available for today's session. Once again, we do have everyone will need to choose a language. So we're offering Spanish interpretation today. And also, so thanks to our captioner, thanks to our Spanish interpreters, and thanks also to our live ASL interpreters for making this an accessible space. You can contact me in the chat if you're having technical difficulties. And just a reminder, again, this is how we've been organizing ourselves for the first few sessions, but to support our presenters and make everything go as smoothly as possible, our presenters would like for you to use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask questions. So the chat is great. I see people are introducing themselves and saying hello. That's great for that purpose. Sometimes our presenters will invite you to participate in the chat, so please do use it when that happens. But for questions, it'll be the most helpful for our presenters in organizing responses if you use the Q&A function for those rather than the chat for those questions. Yeah, I think one final note is that outside of this training series, we do have technical assistance office hours coming up on May 29th. That's like a limited space activity. So it's a Zoom meeting, not a Zoom webinar. It's not a training. It's a place to connect as colleagues around this topic of working with men. So we'll share the registration link in the chat. And so as space remains, you can also sign up for that. And again, that's outside of this training series. Okay, we are recording, and I also want to add that if you're viewing the recording, as not part of this live session, and you are wanting to have a bigger view of the presenters or the ASL interpreters. There are different zooming tools that you can use on your phone or on your computer to make sure that you can do that. So do take advantage of those. Okay, thanks everyone for listening to my introduction. And I am now going to pass it to Sharon, and I think to Jim too, to take it from here. Sharon, thanks for
Great.
being back with us.
Thank you, Lily. Thank you so much for having us. Again, my name is Sharon, she, her pronouns. I am a member of MenHealing as well as a director at the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center. And today I'm going to share with you a model that we use at BARCC to really put together everything that we've been talking about in the last three sessions, coming into our fourth session, and giving you a framework to put everything we've been talking about together for your use and to make it accessible for you. So that's what we're going to do today. So I'm going to be mainly presenting. One of our co-facilitators, Kenton, who presented pretty recently, him and his wife had a baby, and a baby early. Everyone is healthy, but Kenton will not be here today, and we're absolutely okay with that, and we send him our congratulations. But I am unable to see the chat. So Jim, my colleague, who I'll have him introduce himself in a second, will actually be looking at the chat for me, and anything that people want to share. We have reflections and comments. Later on, we'll look at the Q&A when we do the Q&A. So he'll be jumping in here and there to help me do that. So thank you, Jim. And then anything else that I need to be aware of, Jim or Louis might jump in just to let me know again, because I cannot see the chat. But Jim, I want to give you a second to bring your voice into the space and tell us about you.
Yes, this is Jim Struve. I'm Executive Director of MenHealing. I'll be working here behind the scenes to help Sharon today. I'll be presenting in June and July again on screen. And at the end today, I want to spend just a few minutes to share with you about a couple of resources we have to offer lots of you who are working at community agencies. So I'll chime back in at the end for that. Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you, Jim. So today we're talking about carrying conversations about sexual harm and using BARCC SEECK model
Sharon,
to respond. Oh, yes.
hey, this is Louis. I'm sorry. We have a hand raised, and I'm trying to
Okay.
find out if there's I checked in the chat, but I just want to make sure, since I didn't hear back in the chat, if Sherry, maybe there's something
Okay.
in terms of access that we can get fixed. But Sherry, I've allowed you to speak. Could you, what can we help you with, Sherry? Okay. I'm going to remove the permission to talk since we're not hearing anything, so I'm going to assume that that might be an error. Sabdi? Okay. I'm not hearing anything, so I'm going to go back to our main session. I'm going to lower those hands. Sorry for the interruption, Sharon, and sorry for any possible confusion on my end, but I'll just ask folks to share in the chat. You can contact me in the chat if you have anything to follow up on. Okay, that's fine, Sapti. Thanks for saying that. I'm so sorry. I did not mean to have my hand raised. Totally fine. Just want to make sure that we're all able to access the session. So thanks, Sharon. I'll pass it back to you.
Great. No need to apologize. We're collaborating here, and it's wonderful to have this open communication and model that for everyone, because I just think that's important when working with men, as Jim and I were talking earlier. It's just really important to always be there for everyone and provide a space for everyone and their emotions and their experiences and meeting their needs, and how important that is, particularly when working with men. So we are going to be modeling that and be openly transparent and have a fishbowl around the chat and anything else that comes along with today's session. So as I was saying before, is that we are going to be going through a model that we use at the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center. And again, this model is probably not going to be anything new to you. It's not rocket science. It's really about putting everything together that we've talked about so far in a framework that you can pull from that is helpful and accessible to you when working with men. And I know that there are some folks sharing already their introductions in the chat. And Jim, I don't know if you want to just give us a little overview where people are coming in from.
Well, currently we have a really wide array of people from around the United States working at agencies, someone from Japan. And I just lost the chat. There, it's coming back. Yeah, we have great representation from community agencies. Thanks for putting all your information. I won't repeat that, but everybody, if you monitor the chat, you can see how diverse our audience is today.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim. I am currently in Alaska. I usually beam in from Boston, but I'm here for my nephew's graduation. And I have to say I have a new respect for those on the West Coast in Alaska who get up for these webinars, as it's really early. But thank you so much for being here, and thank you for participating from all over the country and Japan. So continue to look at the chat and just to see who's here together with us in community and collaboration as we move forward through this topic. Just take a moment. You know, the topic is about a framework for addressing sexual harm against men. And just give yourself a moment and set an intention. What do you hope to gain from today's session? Just for your own, you don't need to share it, just for yourself. What do you hope to take away from today? And as you think and reflect on that, I'm going to share with you what we hope you take away from today. Our goal is to learn a model for appropriately addressing disclosures of sexual harm done to men and expanding the use of this model to provide continued support to men who've experienced sexual harm. It is really important for us to know that the first time you're hearing a disclosure of sexual violence is very important for the survivor who is sharing that with you. And the more appropriately and kindly you respond to that disclosure, the more likely they are to seek services in the future. See what I did there? And so what's really important, again, is to provide that kind, appropriate response. And this is a framework for that. I don't want to scare you, but the more inappropriate your response, the more blaming, the more shaming, anything like that, the less likely someone is to disclose their experience in the future, or to share their experience or to seek services. But don't you worry, right? That's why we're here, is to learn how to be able to do that. Again, to put all of our tools together. How are we going to do that? So participants will learn the SEECK model developed by the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, to support men survivors of sexual harm. Participants will learn to utilize the concepts of safety, empowerment, empathy, connection, and knowledge to appropriately respond to disclosures of sexual violence done to men, to promote healing and encourage men to seek support. And lastly, participants will expand the SEECK model, safety, empowerment, empathy, connection, and knowledge, to provide ongoing support to men survivors after the disclosure. So the SEECK model was originally developed to respond appropriately to an initial disclosure the first time you're hearing it. However, we've discovered that these tools can actually be used and expanded to an ongoing relationship. And very honestly, these tools are going to be used when working with men survivors, or all survivors, no matter how long you're actually working with them. So again, knowing that this is a model that can be expanded to address ongoing relationships with survivors. And I would also say too, this model can actually be used to address our own vicarious trauma. So just wanted to put that out there for you. I'm not missing anything. Okay, so I think repetition is a great way to learn. So I just want to go over some of the things that we have talked about along the way, so that we can have our foundation for moving into today and using the skills that we have. So what I'm going to ask everyone to do is just take a moment. We're going to do a mindfulness review. I actually learned this from Jim. I want everyone just to take a moment and get settled wherever you are. Take a few breaths, close your eyes if you'd like. Just find a way to get comfortable, to be present in this moment. And I want you to think back to the previous sessions that we've had. The first session being men as survivors. The next one being about reframing trauma. And the third session that we had about identities, intersectionality, and sexual harm done to men. And just notice what's sitting with you. And as we do that, I'm going to review some of the things that we have talked about. So we've talked about barriers. It's really important to know that survivors don't have barriers. Institutions have barriers, systems have barriers, and we as providers have barriers. And it is up to us to be aware of what our barriers are so we can dismantle them for us personally and then dismantle them up into the institutional and systematic level. And what's important to understand about that too is that very often you do have the skills to respond and support survivors of sexual violence, in particular men survivors of sexual violence. But what tends to happen is our barriers, meaning our conditioning, the misconceptions, the myths that we are carrying around sexual violence very often stop us from being able to use the skills that we've learned. So again, it's also about being able to dismantle those barriers so that we can use the skills that we have. And what I mean by that is very often when it comes to survivors sitting in front of us, they may or may not represent what we consider survivors to be or who survivors to be, particularly if it is men, and that might give us a bit of a stop, our breath might catch. So it's important for us to be aware of that so that we can, again, dismantle those barriers and use the skills that we have. Next is the term sexual harm. I know very, very often we flip-flop back and forth at BARCC, we use the term sexual violence, but for these sessions, we're using the term sexual harm, right? Because many men may not recognize what was done to them as violence, so may not see themselves in that definition, or the definitions of rape or sexual assault, which are legal definitions and not clinical definitions. What we want to focus on is the impact of what was done to the men. So we use the term sexual harm. And we say when someone has a sexual experience they don't want or are forced to have in any kind, forced into any kind of sexual act by another person, they've experienced sexual harm. And again, that came from Safe to Talk from New Zealand. Next, we talked a lot about reframing, and reframing is about changing perspective. So using injury versus disorder and seeing men as survivors. You can be a man and a survivor. Talking about the impacts of trauma, right? Everything can be an impact of trauma, but it's important to think about the impacts versus what was done to them and to normalize and validate their experiences. And next is about intersection. So being a survivor is only one identity that folks may carry, and they carry many other identities that impact maybe their survivorship, impact how they are seen, how they seek services, how they receive services, how we see them. And so it's just really important to be aware of all of these things. So I just wanted to do that quick review, quick mindfulness review of those topics so that we can move into the new topics that we're going to be talking about. We talked a lot about intersectionality in the last session. And so today I want to talk about lenses. Very often in the world, we're walking through the world looking through various lenses, and those lenses shift moment to moment, situation to situation. And our lenses are often informed by our identities, our experiences, our histories. And so for us, I want to talk about a few lenses I think it'd be important for us to be looking through throughout the session, but also in working with men who've experienced sexual harm. So survivor-centered, right? We always talk about being, survivor-centered, empowering survivors. So the information we're sharing with you is informed by the survivors and the communities that we serve. And that's really important, that the information, the work that you do really is informed by the people that we are serving, and really thinking about how that impacts and changes the work that we do over time. And so the focus is on empowerment of survivors and providing accessible and appropriate care. Next is equity. And equity is about providing accessible services to all survivors that meet their individual needs to promote their individual healing process. So we are here talking about a group, men survivors, and every men survivor isn't going to be showing or experiencing or talking about all the things that we are talking about. So we've given you tools to pull from to work with the individual in front of you. And so equity is about working with the individual. As we always talk about ABC, always be curious. Be curious about the person in front of you and what their needs are. Again, not assuming, not making judgment, but pulling from the tools that you have to promote their own individual healing process. People need individual things. We want to be able to provide that. And again, to be able to do that is we need to be aware of our barriers. Now, I know most of you, if not all of you, have heard the term trauma-informed. I know it's a bit of a buzzword right now, but it is important for us to think about what that means for us. So it's is understanding the pervasive nature of trauma and symptoms in order to promote healing. I always like to say it's act as if everyone you come in contact with has a trauma history, because most often they do. And then next is men as survivors. So it's important for us, again, looking through that lens, that men can and do experience sexual harm. Now, I talked about being trauma-informed just a moment ago, and I think there's a step further. I think there is something to be said for being sexual trauma-informed. And the definition I'm going to go over with you is a working definition that we have at BARCC to really address this. And I'm not here to compare and contrast types of trauma. I'm just here to talk about sexual trauma. And as many of you know, there is a lot of stigma, a lot of conditioning, a lot of misconceptions about sexual harm that really in the end harm the survivor and impact their ability to seek the services and the resources that they need. And so again, we need to dismantle this by being sexual trauma informed. So if trauma informed is acting as if everyone you come in contact with has a trauma history, I would deepen that and say, act as if everyone you come in contact with has a sexual trauma history. We've talked about the stats in previous sessions. They're high. However, they're probably still not accurate, and they're still probably higher than we believe. So it's best for us just to walk around the world and being sexual trauma informed. What does that mean? Building understanding and empathy toward the experience of betrayal and shame that are unique to the violation of the body, mind, and spirit. I just want to talk about shame for a second. So again, we have an understanding of that in this space. And I know shame is very complicated, but I'm just going to give us sort of a simple way of understanding it here. Guilt, as I see it, is I've done something wrong. I recognize that. I can make amends. Shame is I think that there's something wrong with me. And that this is something that is put onto you. I always call it inappropriate shame because I think shame is put onto us by others and to make us feel as if we've done something wrong. And I think we struggle with shame because we're trying to figure out what is wrong with us. And we can't figure it out because there isn't anything wrong. But that's why there's a constant sort of struggle with trying to understand shame, particularly for survivors. It's also understanding the pervasive impact of shame ascribed to survivors by themselves, systems, and society due to the nature of the crime. Again, I think we need to understand that sexual harm is a crime. It is something that is done to something else that is illegal. And survivors of sexual harm are victims at some point as well, and really recognizing what this is. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that it's a nature of the crime. And next is understanding the specific dynamics, context, impacts, and stigma of sexual violence to provide appropriate and non-judgmental care to reduce shame and facilitate healing. A large part of the work, and as you know in the last 3 sessions, really is getting people to understand that sexual violence is not done in a vacuum, right? There's dynamics, there's context, there's impacts, there's stigmas, there's all these things surrounding it that we need to be educated on as providers and understand, and also pass along that education to the survivors that we're working with so they understand the dynamics, the context, the stigmas, the judgments that they're carrying. One of the things I think is really important when thinking about being sexual trauma informed is that I was just talking about the lenses that we're walking around the world with, but there's also lenses that survivors are walking around the world with. And I don't want to say always, but for most often for survivors, what they're filtering through is a shame lens. And so I want us to be thoughtful again when being sexual trauma informed, that recognizing what we are saying, what we are doing is being filtered through a shame lens. And so being really thoughtful, not about just your intent, but the impact of what you were saying and doing. You know, very often when folks ask why questions, why did you ... The survivor is always going to internalize that and say, well, wait, was I supposed to do something different? Did I do something wrong? So even using, by the way, be very careful when asking why questions, but those why questions, because people are so conditioned, very often are very shameful for folks, and they tend to question themselves and their interactions and experiences, and therefore feeds into the shame. So I think that it's really important for us to be aware of that as well. So the impact is very important. So asking yourself, how is this going to land when I'm speaking to someone who might have a shame lens? How is this going to land for them? So to be really thoughtful about that. Okay. So as we're moving in to talking about, responding to initial disclosures and supporting men who've experienced sexual violence, just some reflections for you. And I know we've talked about this a little bit before, but For your own personal reflection, you're welcome to share if you'd like in the chat, and I'll have Jim monitor that for us. What do you think is your role when responding to a disclosure of sexual violence? So the first time you're hearing it, what do you think is your role when responding to a disclosure of sexual violence?
Listen. Listen, believe, respond with empathy, ask what they need, no judgment, make the survivor feel heard. As an advocate, I am there to support them. Witness, validate, establishing trust. I can listen to the survivor non-judgmentally, believe and support with resources.
Great, thank you. It's a wonderful list. I'm going to say yes to everything. And we'll talk a little bit later about how all these, again, fit into the framework, but absolutely all of these things are real and true. My next question for you to think about for yourself is, what are the barriers to fulfilling this role? If your role is to listen, to believe, to provide empathy, to provide a space, to be non-judgmental, all of those things, what are the barriers that you feel that you have to fulfilling that role?
We can't then make them do what we feel is best. It's their choice.
Yeah, empowerment is hard, right?
Personal stressors, second rate from people in the society. Make sure we do not take the client's emotions. That is really tough. Vicarious trauma. Asks a lack or of limited experiences working with this population. Needing to rush through the session, compassion fatigue. Becoming dysregulated ourselves.
So again, it's really important to identify what's coming up for us and might get in the way of our ability to provide services for survivors. What seems that's coming up very often is inexperience, which that's why you're here and you're going to learn, but also our own stuff that comes up for us. And I know we're going to talk a lot about our own countertransference and our triggering of ourselves and everything that comes up in our session that we're going to be talking about in safety. And Jim is actually going to be presenting on that with me.
Sharon,
we'll be talking a lot about,
yes. Sharon, here's another one that addresses what you were just saying. Second guessing myself, fear of inadvertently making a client feel uncomfortable.
Yep. It's interesting. Excuse me. When I ask this question in various trainings that I do, very often what comes up for people is not knowing what to do, saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing, right? It is very common for us to question ourselves and important for us to question ourselves, because if we feel like we don't have the skills, we attend seminars such as this one to develop those skills. So at least you're aware of some of the things that you might need to learn a little bit more about, particularly working with men, so you can put that into place. And again, thinking about how the work impacts us is also really important. So another question I want to ask everyone is, does your role change if it is a man disclosing an experience of sexual harm? Does your role change if it is a man disclosing their experience of sexual harm?
Several no's. Depends on how she feels. I think it's important to realize that the disclosure might not come as easy and handled with more grace. However, I do go the extra length to make sure that he knows men are assaulted as well.
So our roles and the tools we use may not change. How we use them, we have to be really thoughtful about that, might change, and our beliefs and thoughts about the person disclosing might change.
Here's one that fits with that. Role doesn't change, but the approach may.
It's like I have ESPN. So thank you for whoever said that.
we should know the problems that male survivors tend to have.
Yes, right. So hopefully, again, understanding through these sessions that the role itself doesn't change, right? We have to change. We have to change what folks understand about sexual violence. Again, that reframing. And again, letting men know that they can experience sexual harm. So our role doesn't change, but who we are changes, how we approach it would change. And so it's really being honest and open about that. And hopefully through these questions is also feeling very validated in your experience of thinking about the importance of responding and what that can look like, barriers to responding and what that can feel like. And again, okay, I need to address and recognize what, again, might be coming up for me when working with a man who's experienced sexual violence. Because again, in order for us to make changes, we need to be aware of these things. So thank you all for sharing. And again, this is actually an exercise in empathy. That again, empathy is about being able to relate experiences and to feel less alone in those experiences, even giving permission to feel what you're feeling through that experience.
One more, Sharon, just to add for what you're saying right now, normalizing, but not minimizing, assuring them they aren't alone.
Exactly. Yep. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about the SEECK model. So great. Thank you. Thank you all for sharing. So one of the most important things about being aware of our bias that we have, recognizing that for survivors, maybe when they're coming to us, they might be in crisis, and so they may not be present in the moment, that the most important place for all of us to be is to be as present as possible. When someone's experiencing a flashback, it's the past coming into the present. So the safest and most comfortable place to be is to be as present as possible. For us, and someone comes and discloses us, and we've had all these ideas in our head and all these concerns and worries about what our role is, or saying and doing the right thing, or the survivor may not look like who we think survivors are. If we bring ourselves present, we're more able to be present in that moment so that we can respond or listen to the person who's in front of us and be with them. And that's what's really important about being with them. And so being present is really important. And we talk a lot about that on the weekends of recovery that Jim will talk about later. It's really important to talk with clients, survivors, about what being present is and how important it is, because it's also a part of informed consent, that they're present with us in the moment, being able to be aware of what they're sharing with us and maybe want to be sharing with us or not. But it's also, again, to keep us out of bias, but also allows us to be able to respond to people versus react. So we're just going to take a few moments and practice being present and see if we can understand what that feels like. So very simply, the first thing I would like all of you to ask yourself is, am I present? And now ask yourself, how do I know? And see what you notice. So there are three phases to being present. There's being present, there's not being present, there's awareness that you're not present, so you're present again. And very often we're teetering between being present and not being present. So to simply ask yourself, am I present, brings you more present. To ask yourself, how do I know, brings you even more present. And how do I know? You can check spots in your body. How do I know in my body when I'm present? How do I know? By using the various senses. What am I seeing? What am I hearing? What am I smelling? What am I tasting? And to do all of those things can bring you more present. And so just take a moment again, ask yourself, am I present? And if so, how do I know? And just notice those points of being present. Okay, now bring your attention back to the screen. And so another way of being present is being able to use the breath and the body. So just take a moment. And again, you're welcome to participate in whatever way feels comfortable for you or not. You're welcome to use any practices that you use to bring yourself present. But mindfulness is about being present within your body and your environment. So let's take a moment and just notice all points of contact between you and your environment. What that means is, if you're sitting in your chair or mobility device, just noticing the sitting. Noticing what's around you. What do you see? What do you smell? What do you hear? So just take a moment and notice all points of contact between you and your environment. And the more we use our senses, the more present we become. Okay, now let's move into using the body and the breath. So what I invite everyone to do, again, whatever's comfortable for you, is to loosen your jaw as wide as you can. So open it really wide, and you're going to yawn. I know I always do. Open it as wide as you can. That's comfortable. It's okay to yawn. I'm a sympathetic yawner. And just notice the stretch. And then when you release your jaw, let it hang loosely. Give yourself a little space between your teeth. We do carry a lot of stress in our jaws. And next is our tongue. Most folks don't know this, but we carry a lot of stress in our tongue. So very often our tongue is stuck to the roof of our mouth. So I want you to invite your tongue to lay loose in the bottom of your mouth. I know you become hyper aware of your tongue now, by the way, but allow it to be loose in the bottom of your mouth. And now bring your breath into the belly. And somehow ways I do that is I imagine I swallowed a bowling ball. When it hits my belly, I let it flop. Or I put my hand on my belly and I allow the warmth of my hand to draw the breath into my belly. So points of contact, loose jaw, loose tongue, and breath in the belly. And again, just see what you notice. Sometimes you notice your jaw or tongue tightening again, your belly tightening. So I just invite you again to re-loosen it, re-loosen your jaw, re-loosen your tongue, and put your breath on the belly. So moving on to the next slide, why it's so important to be present is we want to respond versus react. Reactions are automatic, and reactions are usually, they're like this, right? And they're usually based in bias and isms and judgment and conditioning. Responses are a choice. Response is, I'm going to completely listen to everything that's being said, and then I'm going to make a choice, pulling from my tools, about what I'm going to say next. So being present allows us to respond, which is a choice and more appropriate, versus react, which is usually automatic, based in judgment, bias, conditioning, and is usually wrong. And so being present really is important, and I would really encourage you to practice. One of the things that we do, again, in our weekends of recovery is we do a game where we teach, again, the men what mindfulness is and being present is and understanding how that can feel in your body. And then we play a game. And so the game is we will have the men all together repeat the same word 10 times. And then we'll ask a question and we just ask them to call out the answer. And so we always ask them, the first one is to say the color white 10 times. And so we have them say the color white 10 times. And then we ask, what do cows drink? And then people very often say milk. Now, cows don't, baby cows drink milk, yes. Cows do not drink milk, cows drink water. Where I'm from, we say water. Maybe where you're from, you say water. Cows drink water. But what has happened is that we conditioned people, we brainwashed them. That repetition, saying the word white 10 times, and then asking a question about a liquid, our mind's still in the blanks. Very often, our mind, we don't even hear the question. We just make assumptions and fill in the blanks. And usually, again, those assumptions are wrong. Many of you might have experienced too. I know that there's been exercises where you read a passage in a book, let's say, but the words are all jumbled or they're smushed together, but our minds are able to make it out because we've been conditioned to fill in the blanks. There are times when that's absolutely helpful and times when it's not. So when we know we've been conditioned to believe in certain things about sexual harm, it's important for us to be present so we can respond and make a choice about what we're going to say versus a reaction and be steeped in all of that conditioning. Again, we very often do not listen to what is being said. We make a lot of assumptions. And when I asked what your role was, one of the first things that came out was to listen. And so I always joke too that people think listening isn't enough, like it's not an action. But if it wasn't enough and wasn't an action, why is it so hard to listen? Right? So it really is important for us to be thoughtful about that. So being present is a really important skill when working with all survivors of sexual violence, again, so that we can respond versus react. So now I'm going to move into the tools of SEECK, which again is safety, empowerment, empathy, connection, and knowledge. And through this tool is we hope that survivors will seek services. And that's why we have this as an acronym. Plus at BARCC, we just love acronyms. So again, knowing that the more appropriate and the more kindly and warmly you respond to a disclosure without bias or conditioning, the survivor is going to want to seek further services. So let's get into what the SEECK model is. So the first one is safety. And we're going to have a whole nother session on safety and addressing that in June. And we're going to actually expand a little bit more on some of the things I'm sharing with you now. All right. So first I want to ask folks, the safety is something that always comes up. And usually when I ask folks, what do you think survivors need? People always say safety. So I'm curious from all of you is, what is safety?
Freedom from risk of harm.
Mm-hmm.
Stability.
Mm-hmm.
Freedom to be yourself. Being able to be completely vulnerable and feel no shame.
Mm-hmm.
It can be interpreted differently from person to person. Needs being met in a way that provides relief to the nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
Feeling very safe, question mark. Absence of judgment, authentic support. Feeling secure.
Mm-hmm.
Freedom to be heard non-judgmentally and to exist in their identities without needing to explain or feel fear.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to relax, feel calm, moments of clarity and peace.
Thank you. I'm going to stop there. Very often, again, we talk about that survivors need safety, but we don't very often talk about what safety is, or is that even the thing that the person needs? Again, I know I am a trained mental health counselor. I know we talked a lot about safety in my schooling, and a lot of the mental health work is steeped in white supremacy culture. So what is safety? Whose idea of what safety is? Whose idea is how do we measure when someone feels safe or things like that? So I think it's really important for us to make sure that we are questioning for ourselves, what is safety? Is it actually a thing? Is it actually available? Is it the right thing that the person needs? And so someone had actually mentioned something very similar to this, is really asking, and maybe even asking yourself about these things. So I want you to ask yourself, as I ask you this question, what do I need in this moment in order to continue to participate in this training? So we're talking about safety, recognizing that safety may not be the thing. So it's important for us to reflect on what safety is and to reflect on what do we actually need. So we ask our clients, so let's ask ourselves. So I'd like folks to share, if you're willing, what do I need in this moment in order to continue to participate in this training?
Acceptance without judgment.
Time. Okay.
Patience.
Patience. Okay, we'll stop there. Please feel free to keep sharing. So when I asked, what do I need in this moment in order to continue to participate in this training? No one said safety, right? They said acceptance, not judgment, time, and patience. So I think it's really understanding that people are going to need various things, and it's important for us to explore what that is for them, and to ABC, always be curious. I know very often, and Jim could probably speak to this too, that when we ask the men on our weekends of recovery about safety, they're very often surprised that we actually ask. We talk a lot about it. We think that survivors need it. We try to provide it, but very often we aren't asking what it is for them. And to be honest with you, people are very surprised. Also, safety, again, may not be the thing that they need. For some folks, safety was never a thing, right? They never had that experience, or What's safe for one person may not be safe for another person. So we really need to be thoughtful and aware about that and asking the questions. So safety, again, is not equitable. So what does that individual need? So asking them, what do you need in this moment to be able to engage in what we're doing, right? That's the question. And then whatever they need, such as, I think we said acceptance, patience, time, recognizing what those things are. And all of those things are on a continuum and working with the survivor to understand the continuum. What is trust, respect, comfort for you? How do you know when you're experiencing that? What does that look like for you? And again, being able to really fully investigate and explore that is really going to be helpful. And again, having us understand what it is that they actually need. And so again, what's important is also to be transparent and honest, that we need to be honest and transparent about what we can and cannot do as well when it comes to their expectations and needs. We can't guarantee we're not going to cause harm to folks. And so I think it's important to be open and honest about that. And then privacy is always really important too. When we think about our survivors and what they share with us, and if we need to share it with anybody else, that they're aware of that. And they know where their story is going. Unless they have to disclose, I wouldn't recommend it. But it's just important for us, again, to be very honest with them about all the information we're keeping, all the things we're sharing, where the information is going. And that can help provide that comfort, that respect, that patience, that acceptance. So what does that sound like? So it's simply asking folks, what are your safety concerns? It's okay to be direct and ask those questions. My favorite question is, again, is what do you need in this moment in order to engage or share what you need to share to get your needs met? Because it might be safety, might be safer, safe enough, might be trust, trusting, comfort, more comfortable, those kind of things. But really it's taking the time to ask and explore what it is for them, what it feels like for them. How do they know they're going to experience that? How do they know that when they're not getting what they want? And so again, being able to have those conversations. Now we think about safety beyond the disclosure. These are things you're already doing. But just to remind you that safety is something that we are consistently exploring. And again, whether it's comfort or trust or respect. So it's always important to start from the present. How are they doing today? How is what they're experiencing impacting them today? What they need moment to moment may change. So making sure that we're asking those questions, that we're checking in. What they need, again, is on a continuum. So is the continuum changing? How is it changing? Again, listening. Again, I had that survivor speaker that I work with who was asked one time, how do you know when someone's listening? And she said, when someone actually responds to what I just said. So that's really important. Giving quiet. I tend to use the word quiet versus silence. Silence is a word often associated with keeping a secret. And many of the men we've worked with were forced to keep a secret and sit in silence. So I tend to use the word quiet, but giving space for whatever they need and exploring that with them. And again, curiosity and teaching curiosity to the survivors and teaching them to explore what things are, how they feel, how they know when they're getting what they need or not getting what they need, and things like that. And then again, transparency, full transparency, educate everyone about everything. So empowerment, and I do recognize sometimes empowerment, it was said earlier, can feel hard because maybe we feel like there's something that someone else needs or should be doing that they're not. But again, that's not about us. That's about us, not about them. So again, the equity lens is focusing on them as individuals in their own healing process and being able to provide what they need by asking the questions. And so empowerment is recognizing survivors are the experts on their own lives. Again, we've got tools we're pulling from, experience we're pulling from, but really in the end, they are the experts on their own lives. So we want to center that specific survivor equity lens and their experience. It's about options and choice. And we all know that sexual violence is about power and control. And control in its smallest form is the ability to make decisions. So giving a space for choice and decisions everywhere, right? Someone comes in the office, where would you like to sit? Things like that. I will say when there's options, there has to be at least two. You can do this or not. Providing or not is really important, particularly if someone's in crisis. They may not know that there's two options. So provide an option, there must be two. So you can do this or not. And again, making sure at least two options. Respect and honor their decisions. So again, they might make choices that maybe we don't agree with, right? It's not about us, it's about them. So how do we help them with the decisions that they've made, and then prompting into the next steps after that decision. So respect and honor their decisions. Using mirroring language, so correct pronouns, correct name, and also calling it what they call it. We want to be really thoughtful about naming something for someone else, as we want them to be able to name it. So using whatever language they use to refer to what was done to them is also really important. If they don't have anything they refer it to, you can refer to it as harm. So what does that sound like? What would be most helpful right now? So when someone's coming to you, it's always important to stay in the present and the focus on the here and the now. What would be most helpful right now? It's okay if they don't know, but still important to ask the question. Would you like to hear about resources that are available to you or not? Would you like to talk about next steps or not? So those are the ways that we can really recognize and understand how we are. By the way, we don't give empowerment, we uplift empowerment. People have their own decision-making power and control. And with sexual harm, that might feel like as if it's taken away or reduced, and we're just here to uplift that. So again, empowerment is about being present, strengths-based. Like empowerment is always building on a foundation that people already have. So when you're trying to find coping skills, we always ask people, what have you done in the past to cope? And so we build from those experiences. And so strengths-based. Decision-making, again, just helping in the decision process without judgment, without influence, and then helping with those next steps. Again, teaching curiosity, mirroring, so reflecting back to them the things they've shared, and always checking in. Again, as we move on past the disclosure and more work with folks, things change. What they need might change, how they're getting what they need might change, many things might change. So being able to check in throughout your time with them, just to make sure that you're all on the same page and that they're getting their needs met. Next is empathy. And very often empathy is described as putting yourself in someone else's shoes. We are never, ever, ever in anyone else's shoes. Everyone's experiences are completely different. Everyone's histories, identities, ways they experience things, all are very different. What I see empathy as, just like us, we can use our relatable experience to remember that survivors have their own experiences, their impacts and needs, and we want to be asked what we want in that moment. So I feel like empathy is just reminding ourselves to ask the questions. We wish that people would just ask us questions when we needed it, and provided us support in this way that we wanted support. And so again, that's what that is. And along with that, these were mentioned earlier, empathy is also validating. Everyone's experience is their own, and that's it. There's no judgment on that. It's their own experience. And normalizing is letting people know that they're not alone in those experiences. So even as we're going through this, again, we talked about validating and normalizing, you already have these skills. It's just putting them into a framework that feels helpful to you when maybe feeling as if some of your barriers around being able to handle disclosure of sexual harm by a man, that you're able to pull from this framework. But again, it's not rocket science. So empathy is, I believe you, thank you for sharing with me. And I will tell you the top 2 reasons why survivors do not disclose is not being believed and being judged. So just imagine if you didn't judge them and believe them when they disclosed. Providing that validation. It makes sense you would be angry. Anger is a reasonable reaction to what you experienced. And then normalization. I've talked to other survivors who've also talked about struggling with nightmares. You are not alone. No one really wants to be alone. I know I've run many groups, and I'm sure many of you have. And for survivor groups, I often have survivors saying, I'm glad we have this group. I'm sad we have this group, but I'm glad we have this group so we can do this all together. And so empathy and connection is important as well. So empathy is about believing, being non-judgmental, validating, normalizing, listening, being curious, and using the term and. Very often we say something when we use the word but, as we say at the start of a sentence, and it's maybe something positive or maybe even more neutral. We say but, and it really gets rid of the whole first part of that sentence and only focuses on the last part, right? I've come so far, but I have so far to go. That feels different than I've come so far and I have far to go. It feels very different. To allow space for both, number one, keeps us out of judgment, keeps us out of the need to decide what is what, right? Because people can have many experiences, many reactions, many feelings all at one time. And to give space for all of those things is really important. Again, it keeps us out of judgment, keeps us from deciding what we need to talk about first, giving all that space. So the word and is really important. And I would actually encourage all of you to replace the use of the word but in your language and replace it with the word and, to give space for all things, because all things are true. And it is important, again, to recognize all the truths. Next is connection. Judith Herman wrote a book called Trauma and Recovery. Many of you may know it. We joke and call her Mama Trauma. But she's written a lot of books about trauma. And she actually says that trauma is a disease of disconnection. So if folks we're working with have experienced sexual trauma or sexual harm, one thing we need to then set forth is the ability to connect to self, to others, to nature, to community. So being able to build connection. Because for survivors, isolation or feeling isolated can be an ongoing impact of sexual harm. And so again, an antidote to isolation is connection. Being connected is a key part of seeking or receiving support. See what I did there? And being connected to self, others, community, and nature. So let's talk about connection. So we have a colleague of ours who wrote a book, Howard Fradkin, and it's called Joining Forces, and it's about men who've experienced sexual harm. And this is a tool that he uses to teach men to understand connection in self, relationships to others, nature, things like that. And so we're going to go through this just a little bit. And so again, this is just personal reflection for yourself, is thinking about people and your connections with people as traffic lights. That there are people in our lives who are red light people. These are people that we cannot share things with. We don't feel safe enough or comfortable enough or respected enough to be able to share with them. And there are characteristics of red light people. They're judgmental. They're not open. They maybe only see the negative in the world. And you know what I'm talking about. And in your own head, you can come up with ideas or characteristics of red light people. And then there's green light people, people in our lives that we know we can talk to. Who are those people? What are the characteristics? We can trust them because maybe we have a shared experience. I know them. I have a history with them. They're not judgmental. They listen. All the things that we have just talked about in the model of SEECK can help you be a green light person. But very often when we are working with survivors, we're an unknown. So we're more of a yellow light person. Yellow light means caution. Again, a lot of it comes from just maybe past experiences. Again, carrying around the shame that is ascribed to survivors. Again, just not knowing them. And so we're yellow light people. And so I think what's important for us when working with men who've experienced sexual violence is to recognize in our beginning interactions with them that we are yellow light people. We are an unknown, and they're carrying a lot of stigma and experiences and shame that have been ascribed to them from previous experiences. And so what we want to focus on is being green light people. That we want to really think about what are the characteristics that are going to help in this moment to build trust, respect, comfort, those types of things. And those are the skills that you're going to want to be doing. And so I encourage you to think about this in your own life. I encourage you to use this tool with any survivors that you're working with to be able to assess relationships, but also even situations as well. And so connection sounds like, how are you today? And actually meaning it and listening when someone tells you. It's always really nice to know that people are thinking about you. I don't know about you, but when I get a text and someone's like, I've been thinking about you, it feels really good. Asking people, what do you need in terms of support? Like, what is support for you? And then letting them know, here is how I can support you. So again, being transparent about any limitations within your role that you have and letting them know what you're able to do and not do. And so connection is also about being present. Being present, I don't know if you've figured this out already, is part of all of the tools. Curiosity is as well. If we spend time in curiosity, we spend less time in judgment. Reframing, so providing a different perspective again on relationships, such as using the red light, yellow light, or green light system. And connection is about relationships. So being able to explore relationships with folks, like, how do you know if you're connected to somebody? How do you know in your body when you're connected to somebody? And so maybe even exploring the idea of what connection is. I very often ask people, what is your support system? And they give me like a list of things. And I say, well, how do you use your support system? And it's like complete silence. So we don't want to assume that because we have relationships that they understand what they are or actually utilizing them in the healthy way. So being able to explore what relationships are and Then how do they know if they're connected in those relationships? And being really, again, be able to explore that and investigate that using that curiosity is also really helpful. And again, always transparency. We build trust by being transparent. And last part of our SEECK model is knowledge. And so knowledge is you do not need to be their only support. I think it's really important to understand that when we work with survivors, that they can have other support systems, and being, again, to explore what those are and helping them to understand how to utilize other support systems, like to spread that around. Again, be transparent about your limitations. Share your resources and ways of taking care of oneself. Knowledge is also recognizing that you're impacted. You as providers are impacted, but also survivors are impacted around what's happening in the world, and we all really need to take care of ourselves, and ways of doing that and sharing that and feeling validated and normalized in that. People also feel, I know sometimes when I feel a certain way, I might WebMD to see if I can understand what's going on with me, because having that knowledge can relieve some of the stress, because I know then what I can do with it. So sharing information about sexual harm, such as common impacts, to validate and normalize a survivor's experience, to educate about the dynamics and the conditioning, can feel really helpful. And again, in reducing that shame and increasing their understanding of the dynamics and context of sexual violence. So passing the knowledge on that you have around the experience of sexual harm done to men, to the men that you are working with. And what does that sound like? Letting people know I can help in this way is really important. I think for a lot of us, in the helping field, is we tend to want to do more than we can or need to be doing. I don't like to use the word should, so I won't. But letting people know it's okay too. So survivors of sexual harm have had their boundaries crossed. It is just as important for us as providers to make sure that we're also setting boundaries and following up with those boundaries appropriately. And if we aren't the right person to provide that care, then referring them to someone else or working with someone else who can. So I'm not the right person to provide that type of support, but I can refer you to people or places that can. Would you want that information or not? And how can I help you gain other resources? So again, spreading around the resources. We want to build connection to self, others, community, and nature. And would you like to know more about the common impacts of trauma or not? So again, being able to ask the questions, that's empowering. Providing a sense of providing choice is also really important. So what does that sound like? So psychoeducation, again, a lot of what we've done in the last couple of sessions, including today, is psychoeducation. The more knowledge people have, the more understanding they have, the more we can reduce the shame that has been ascribed to them, again, by just helping them understand the dynamics and challenging their own misconceptions and myths and conditioning about sexual violence. To talk about coping. Again, the more I get in this field, I really recognize that folks may or may not talk about what coping is. I very often ask clients what's coping, and they go, well, dealing with it. And I'm like, okay. And what is that? And they really can't tell me. So I think it's just really important for us too to have conversations about coping skills. And that coping skills are about reducing the experience in the moment. So it's finding tools to reduce whatever they're experiencing in the moment that might feel too big. It's being able to reduce it in the moment so you can move to the next step. Because very often people will forget that coping is an ing. They would have said, I thought I coped with that. There's no ed when it comes to coping, right? It's an ing. And so again, being able to educate people about what coping is, being realistic about what that is. It's an ing. It's tools to help reduce the experience in the moment, not to make it go away. And then summarizing and planning, at the end of a group or a session or whatever, is just sort of talking about the key topics that you've gone over and thinking about what they're going to do next. So very often I will ask, what are you taking away from today and how are you going to utilize it in your life? And so what that does is, again, it helps them to reiterate and to integrate some of the things that have been talked about. Also helps you understand whether or not you and the survivor are on the same page at the end of the day, and then thinking about what the next steps are. Sometimes for us, when working with survivors, and maybe if it was just like a difficult session that felt very emotional, it's hard for us to end the session sometimes, and also for the survivor. And so I think planning a next step is a really important tool for us as providers that helps us feel a little bit better about ending that session in that moment and letting them go, because we feel like there's a next step and a plan. Knowledge is also offering resources and referrals. So as you probably have already sensed as we went through, again, none of these things are new to you. It's just, again, being able to put it into a framework of SEECK that when you're feeling like you may or may not have the skills as we're learning, or you feel like your bias might get in the way, that you can pull from these tools in your toolbox. And this is just a framework. And I forgot to mention before, but there's no order to this. These are just the things you need to address in the beginning, but there's no, don't address safety first and empowerment. You're doing all these things simultaneously. So hopefully, again, this just gave you a framework in being able to work with men survivors and to build some confidence in your knowledge and skills, and being able to be present with men and provide them the services that they need. Jim, did you want to jump in now before I move on? I'm talking about the weekends of recovery.
Sure. Let me come on screen here a second if I can. What I wanted to offer is to just build on what Sharon has been sharing about connection, and to make everyone aware. You may already know some of this, but to be aware that MenHealing, we offer weekends of recovery, which is an opportunity to bring men who have experienced sexual harm together to heal with other men who have experienced sexual harm. So those are available. You can find linkages to those weekends at our website, menhealing.org. But two things I want to mention is, one is that not everybody can attend a weekend. Not everybody can travel, expenses, etc. So we're making a big push for 2025 to reach out and invite anyone at the local level, individual providers, networks, agencies, to contact MenHealing, and for us to work with you to develop a collaboration for a day of recovery experiences in your own community, basically honing down the weekend into a single day, and that where we will come with some of our staff to work with some of your staff to do something in your community. And that may allow you then to continue services for men beyond just that experience. But let us know. We really want to build some collaborations with agencies. Reach out to us. Just go to our website, make a general inquiry. I or someone will follow up with you. And then the second thing I want to be sure that everyone is aware of is that we now have virtual access support groups. So anyone, a lot of times agencies don't have enough men to start a group. Well, one of the ways you can get around that is refer people to our website. They can sign up on a wait list. That may also be a good entry point to begin to work on healing prior to reaching out and coming to a day or a weekend. So we have community survivor groups, 6 to 8 sessions, which will be launching. And we now have trained survivors to be peer leaders, and we supervise them so they're peer led. And we will be offering those as we get enough people to fill groups. We'll keep launching new groups because we have enough peer leaders. And we are starting groups for partners. So partner support groups as well. So wanted everyone to be aware of these resources for the weekends of recovery, the collaborative days of recovery, and the online virtual access support groups. Thanks.
Thank you. And as a plug, the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center has worked with MenHealing to provide these days of recovery in the Boston area. And we did quite a few, very successful in person. Then COVID hit and we did some online. So I do recommend, if you're curious about being able to provide these for your community, to reach out. So now moving into our summarizing and planning phase, using the SEECK model. We just talked about resources. Now we're moving into summarizing and planning. Is just if people wanted to share before we move into the Q&A, what are you taking away from this training and how will you use it in your work? And again, what are you taking away from this training and how will you use it in your work? Okay, is anyone sharing,
Nope.
Jim? No.
No,
Okay.
looks like the responses are silent, but perhaps directing people to the evaluation. We really appreciate your feedback. Here's one. It's so important knowing how men feel and think about these issues. I would like to know what men think about dating women today, how to approach them. Very helpful for working with men as sane, to self-evaluate, take a look, look a little deeply. The traffic light analogy was excellent. And I think starting from a place of an advocate being a yellow light helps curb ego when survivors don't trust it's right away.
Great. Thank you. And I would just continue, encourage you to continue to ask yourself what you're taking away from today and how you're going to incorporate it into your work. I'm going to turn off my screen and the slides, and we're going to take a look at the Q&A if there's any questions. So Louis, I'm just going to pass that on to you as I get my slides down. If there's any questions.
Hi, it's Louis. Sharon, you know what? I'll turn my video on. Hang on. Hi. Thanks so much, Sharon and Jim. And we do have one comment in the Q&A. Please tell me when the group therapies by therapists for male survivors had started in US history. So kind of like, when did people start doing these group therapies? I don't know that there's an answer that you can provide, but maybe talk about MenHealing's history, if not.
I mean, I can talk about BARCC's history and maybe have Jim talk about MenHealing. So BARCC actually has been providing groups for men since 1998 in response to the priest abuse scandal that came out of the Boston Archdiocese. So we've been providing individual and group counseling for men probably previous to that, but that we do know that that is a timeline when we started doing those services. So Jim, do you want to talk a little about MenHealing's history?
Yeah, just really simply, the first gathering of bringing together people to talk about male sexual harm was in 1988. And at that time, the only way to get an audience was having in conjunction with a conference that worked with sexual offenders. So we added a day on, and then the next year we had an exclusive conference for non-offending male survivors. So that was 1989. And then things progressed, and we began to offer conferences around the country for a series of years that led to the formation of what's now malesurvivor.org. And in 2001, we launched the Weekends of Recovery, which is the 3-day programs. In 2018, MenHealing formed to continue the journey of the weekends. And we just last year celebrated our 102nd Weekend of Recovery. And in 2021, kind of an outgrowth from COVID, we then had the skill set of using Zoom. So we realized we could start offering more supportive services virtually. So that's when we launched the current support group model. And as we've been doing that, we've been getting very positive feedback from men who've been to our weekends. We now want to extend it to men who have not yet been to a weekend. And lastly, we realized one of the groups that are left out of services is partners, family, and allies. So we're now extending our support groups to reach those people who also need our time and attention.
Thanks, Jim and Sharon. I think that those were great ways of answering that question. What a great history. I don't see anything else in the Q&A. I see a nice comment in the chat. You all have been the best. That's so nice to read. Thank you. I think you're really talking to Sharon and Jim, but I'll say thank you on behalf of everyone.
Louis, we think you're the best. All right, then. So again, MenHealing and BARCC are resources for you. You have the websites available to you, and you have our resources as well as, what do you call them? In the slides, not resources, yeah, but with the biography. Louis, I can't think of the word.
What? I'm sorry, in the slides?
References. Sorry, we have the references.
References.
Yes. I couldn't find the
dear.
word. Our websites and also references in our slides, and please feel free to reach out to any of us.
And if I could just add a pitch, Our sixth session, which will be on July 9th, I just want to alert people, if you haven't looked forward on the schedule, we will be having a survivor panel. We're bringing together several men who've been through our weekends, and they're going to in person be here to talk with you, with each other, about their experience of healing.
Thanks, Jim, for making sure people know what's coming up. Great. Thanks, Sharon. Thanks to our whole team, Alex and Amber, for providing live ASL interpretation. Thank you so much to Esperanza and Vanessa for doing live Spanish interpretation, Marie for captioning, Ashley for sharing all those resources in the chat, and thanks to Jen and Sarah for recording, so others can get the great info shared during this session. Thanks, everyone.